The history of the Astrakhan Khanate is usually considered in the context of being somewhere between the Golden Horde and the Moscow Tsardom as a brief episode before the real events. Meanwhile, Astrakhan was a place where quite practical matters were decided. Control over the lower Volga meant control over trade, income, and the movement of people. And anyone who seriously claimed influence in this region one way or another ended up facing Astrakhan. And in this video, we will trace the path from the emergence of the Khanate on the ruins of the Horde to its disappearance from the political map. And before we begin, I welcome all viewers to the Amazing History channel. Thank you for being here and for supporting us with likes and kind comments. Special thanks to the channel's sponsors. It's thanks to you that videos like this are possible at all. Now let's figure out why the lower Volga once became the key to all of Eurasia. But we should start today's story not with the Khanate, but with the place where it appeared. The lower Volga has never been just a matter of geography. Goods traveled along this river from east to north. Furs and silver went downstream, while fabrics, spices, weapons, and people moved upstream. The Volga connected the steppe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Slavic lands into a single exchange system, where money, power, and influence flowed almost as continuously as the water itself. Here, you didn't need to own vast territories or be strong. It was enough to control the crossings, river mouths, markets, and places where duties were collected. Fish fed the cities, salt brought a steady income, and trade provided what nomadic raids could not, a constant flow of resources. That's exactly why they held on to the lower Volga. This land was shaped as a borderland from the very beginning. Nomads came and went, cities appeared and disappeared, and power changed hands more often than the names of the tribes. Therefore, when the Golden Horde collapsed, the lower Volga became a prize that everyone with strength and ambition began to fight for. But let's talk about that in a bit more detail. The collapse of the Golden Horde in the 15th century was not a single event. It was accompanied by a series of crises, internal conflicts, and the loss of control over the outskirts. After the death of Khan Takhtamish and Timur's campaigns, the Horde system began to fall apart. And by the middle of the 15th century, several independent Khanates already existed in its place. One of them was the state in the lower Volga, which contemporaries knew as Khadzhi-Tarkhan. Next, let's clarify some terms. Astrakhan, as we know it today, did not yet exist at that time. The center of the Khanate was the city of Khadzhi-Tarkhan, which stood upstream on the Volga compared to the future Astrakhan. It was around this city that the Khanate was formed, which was later retrospectively called the Astrakhan Khanate. Why? Because when historians in the 17th to 19th centuries began to systematize the past, they needed stable and understandable names. It was inconvenient to say the Khanate of Khadzhi-Tarkhan because by that time the city had already disappeared, and everyone knew the region as the Astrakhan area. That's why the states of the 15th-16th centuries began to be called the Astrakhan Khanate by the territory, and not by its actual capital. And for the purposes of this video, we will also call it Astrakhan. Usually, the founding date of the Astrakhan Khanate is considered to be 1459 when Khan Mahmud, a descendant of the Horde dynasty, established his rule in Khadzhi-Tarkhan. He was not just some random ruler, but a representative of the same political tradition as the Khans of Kazan or Crimea. His power was based on the Horde model, that is, the custom of ruling through tribute collection, control of trade routes, and recognition from neighboring states. That's why the new Khans called themselves heirs of the Horde, not out of some kind of nostalgia, but because for everyone around them, from the steppe clans to neighboring rulers, this was a clear language of legitimacy. In the first decades after its emergence, the Astrakhan Khanate continued to exist in a world where the Horde order still functioned. Despite the collapse of the Golden Horde, in the 15th century the Great Horde still existed, which continued to claim the status of the main heir to the Chinggisid authority. And this meant that the Astrakhan Khans were forced to take into account the interests of the Great Horde, especially in matters of legitimacy. Recognition or non-recognition by the Horde Khan still remained an important factor in the eyes of the steppe nobility. At the same time, the Great Horde no longer possessed its former resources and could not strictly control the region, acting more as a political arbiter than as a real suzerain. At the same time, the Nogai Horde was increasing its influence. Unlike the Great Horde, the Nogai Mirzas did not claim the symbolic legacy of the Chinggisids, but controlled vast steppe territories around the lower Volga. It was they who increasingly became either a real support or, on the contrary, a threat to the Astrakhan Khans. After 1480, when the influence of the Great Horde sharply weakened, this dependence only increased. The Horde center continued to exist for more than 2 decades, but its role in regional politics was rapidly diminishing. The final defeat of the Great Horde in 1502 deprived the Astrakhan Khanate of its last external source of Horde legitimacy. As a result, by the beginning of the 16th century, the Khanate found itself in a fundamentally new situation, where the previous model of existence through dynastic maneuvers and external recognition began to systematically fail. Before we go any further, let's take a closer look at the economy, as this fact will be quite important in the history of the Khanate. Khadzhi-Tarkhan was important not because the Khan resided there, but because money flowed through it. Almost everything that made the Khanate viable was connected not with land or military power, but with the movement of goods, people, and caravans. The lower Volga in the 15th and 16th centuries was a corridor, and whoever controlled it automatically became a participant in the great game. Khadzhi-Tarkhan was a major trading hub and the main source of income for the Khans. Goods were transshipped here, ships were changed, and duties were paid. Unlike the steppe states that lived off raids, the Astrakhan Khanate made its money by letting other people's wealth pass through its territory. Fish and salt held a special place. Sturgeon fisheries and salt lakes provided a stable income that did not depend on a successful raid or a bad year. These resources were needed by everyone, and that's why people were willing to pay for them. It was exactly this quiet money that made Khadzhi-Tarkhan valuable even when the Khan's power was weakening. But this model also had a downside. The Khanate's economy was too dependent on the outside world. As soon as relations with Crimea, the Nogai hordes, or Moscow soured, trade would immediately decline. Caravans would simply change their route, and the Khan's treasury would start to run dry. And in this situation, without a solid military base, the Khanate had to get involved in the regional game, where every step had to be carefully calculated. The Astrakhan Khanate, for almost its entire short existence, lived not by its own agenda, but in the shadow of stronger players. The closest and most dangerous neighbor was the Crimean Khanate. For Crimea, the lower Volga was a natural zone of influence, so the Crimean Khans regularly interfered in the affairs of Khadzhi-Tarkhan, supporting some claimants to power and removing others. The Nogai Horde played a different role. It was not a centralized state, but a union of clans whose nobility often directly determined the fate of the Khanate. The Nogai Mirzas could also easily put their own candidate on the throne, but just as easily could turn away from him. But above all this stood the Ottoman Empire, albeit not directly. Istanbul closely monitored the situation in the region through Crimea. The Ottomans were interested in the Caspian, trade, and limiting the growth of Moscow. Therefore, supporting the right Khan in Khadzhi-Tarkhan fit perfectly into their strategy, even if it was not about direct control, but about influence. And against this backdrop, the Moscow state is becoming increasingly active. By the end of the 15th century, when Ivan III was expanding his influence primarily through diplomacy, the kingdom was not yet engaging in direct conquests in the Volga region, but it was already actively working with the Khans through embassies, treaties, and trade privileges. At the beginning of the 16th century, Moscow's embassies appeared more and more frequently in Khadzhi-Tarkhan. Officially, it was about trade, friendship, and mutual benefit. Moscow offered protection from Crimea and the Nogais, and in return expected loyalty and free passage along the Volga. For the Astrakhan Khans, this seemed like a reasonable compromise. They felt an alliance with distant Moscow was safer than relying on their nearby, more aggressive neighbors.
Соседей.
Government allies and neighbors. The reign of Khan Abdulrahman marked a turning point. In the early 16th century, he aligned with Moscow and accepted its patronage. In response, Moscow supported his claim to power, effectively acting as an arbiter in the Khan's internal conflicts. However, this friendship came at a price. Every time Moscow helped one Khan, it secured for itself the right to interfere in the affairs of the Khanate. By the middle of the 16th century, the Astrakhan rulers could no longer ignore the opinion of Moscow's envoys, and any Khan who did not satisfy Moscow risked losing its support and therefore his power. However, the internal problems of the Astrakhan Khanate began even before Moscow's interference, almost immediately after it was established as an independent state. In the less than a century-long history of the Khanate, about 13 Khans changed power here, and some of them returned to the throne 2 or even 3 times. Such a game of musical chairs in itself indicates the absence of a stable mechanism for transferring power. One of the most notable figures of this crisis period was Yamguchi Khan. His reign took place under constant pressure and conflicts. Seeking to strengthen his position, he relied on the Crimean Khanate, and through it, on the Ottoman Empire. This was a logical step from the perspective of steppe politics, but under the new circumstances, it resulted in isolation from Moscow and the loss of some internal support. A significant part of the nobility was not ready to pay for this choice with increased external pressure and the risk of war. Another change of power led to Dervish Ali returning to the throne, but this time with direct support from Moscow. In 1554, Moscow's troops occupied Khadzhi-Tarkhan without serious resistance, thus securing his power. It turns out that Dervish Ali became a Khan whose legitimacy depended on external power, not on internal authority. After all, for some of the Astrakhan nobility, he was a temporary figure imposed from outside. Probably trying to win back their favor, Dervish Ali decided to change sides and seek support from Crimea and the Ottoman Empire. But this attempt to sit on 2 chairs only hastened the outcome. For Moscow, it became confirmation that the system of a dependent Khanate no longer worked. And in 1556 it was decided to act directly. In the spring, the Moscow army moved toward the lower Volga. The campaign was not large in numbers, but it was carefully prepared. The timing was chosen very well. The Astrakhan Khanate had neither a stable army nor allies ready to immediately stand up for it. The Crimean Khanate was preoccupied, and the Ottoman Empire either lacked time or saw no need to respond. The Nogai nobility, as before, preferred to wait it out, not risking anything for a Khan whose position already seemed hopeless. The Moscow detachments destroyed Khadzhi-Tarkhan with little resistance. Much of the local nobility either didn't oppose them or had already sided with the victors. Dervish Ali fled, having finally lost his power. With this, the Astrakhan Khanate ceased to exist as a political entity. Moscow's decision was formalized in the strictest way possible. The Khan's authority was not preserved even in a nominal form, as had sometimes happened before. The territory of the Khanate was directly incorporated into the Moscow state, under the rule of a voivoda. This meant a complete rejection of the previous policy of compromises and temporary alliances. It soon became clear that the old city was also unsuitable for the new tasks. Moskva needed not a Khanate-style trading center, but a fortress capable of controlling the Volga Delta and repelling possible attacks from Crimea and the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, it was decided to move the center closer to the mouth of the river. This is how the construction of the new Astrakhan began. The Khanate was the natural result of Ivan Grozny's policies in the Volga region. After the capture of Kazan in 1552, it was Astrakhan that completed the issue of controlling the entire Volga, from its upper reaches all the way to the Caspian Sea. This was a strategic turning point. Now the Moscow state was finally moving beyond the boundaries of northeastern Rus and turning into a power operating in the Eurasian space. The Astrakhan Khanate disappeared because the world in which it existed stopped functioning. The policy of balancing temporary alliances and constantly maneuvering between powerful neighbors was effective during the Horde era, but proved powerless against a new type of centralized state. That's all from me. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.
Пока.